Hey, open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 1. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one in the pews in front of you. We're going to be working our way around the scriptures today, Old and New Testament, but Matthew chapter 1, scroll there, turn there, whatever it looks like for you. Matthew chapter 1, verse 16 says that Jacob fathered Joseph. Now, if you weren't sure where in the scriptures you were reading, you might think you were in the Old Testament. But no, here we are, New Testament. Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. This is the first Sunday of Advent. We're celebrating this, looking forward to the coming of Messiah. And that's verse 16. Now, if you were to read verse 15 in Matthew 1, Eliud fathered Eleazar, Eleazar fathered Matan, and Matan fathered Jacob. That's probably not a verse that you're going to memorize, right? In fact, if you were reading this in your daily Bible reading, that might be a flyover verse. You know how we have flyover states? Well, we have a flyover verse there. In fact, if you were reading most of Matthew chapter 1 prior to that, you would probably fly over a lot of those names too. You know, Eliakim, Azor. You might pick up in verse 13 on Zerubbabel, just because it's such a fun name to say. Or verse 11, Josiah, or clear up to verse 5 and 6, David and Solomon. Yeah, it's starting to, the bells are starting to ring. I'm catching some of those. But go up to verse 2. This is a genealogy of the Messiah. Luke chapter 3, Matthew chapter 1. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. We've basically seen this family heritage all the way back to Abraham. And Luke chapter 3 goes all the way back to Adam. Why is that important? Because the Jewish people were longing for the Messiah. They were looking for and hastening and wondering, and when is he going to come? This one who will deliver this one who will give us new hearts, this one who put himself, his own presence right within us. Advent is about looking ahead, about God giving us the greatest gift, God fulfilling his promise to Abraham, really, by blessing us. Last week we looked at Isaac's faith and kind of the crazy story of Jacob and Esau and how that all kind of twisted around in this transformation of Jacob's life from being a grabber to, in verse 21, being a giver. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. That's our focus for today. But notice the transformation that takes place. Because in verse 20, remember, Jacob was the grabber, the grasper, the conniver, the deceiver. And it took faith for Isaac to believe that his dysfunctional family could ever receive the promise of God. The promise that God had given Abraham and then passed on to Jacob and was waiting to pass on to the next generation. And Isaac had to believe that God had something better in store for them. The key idea today is that once you've been blessed, you want to be a blessing to others. And we'll see it through the ongoing story of Jacob. We looked last week at this idea of not being able to be blessed when we're putting on somebody else's identity. That we can't expect God to bless the person we want other people to think we are. Jacob dressed up like Esau to get the blessing. And then we saw that we can't be blessed until we're willing to be honest with who we really are. That Jacob had a life crisis. God said, go back to Canaan. Well, God, you know that Esau is there, right? And God says, yeah, I know. That's one of the big reasons I'm having you go back. And so Jacob had to face the music and in the process of that wrestled with God and then hung on to God. And when the man he was wrestling with, the angel, that said, "Who are you?" He said, I'm a deceiver. Being honest with God is one of the key places of understanding who we are and that the journey that we go on. And then he's able to be reconciled together with Esau. Now, turning your Bibles to Genesis chapter 35. I told you would need your copy of the scriptures today. Genesis 35. Rachel has already had one son, verse 16. They journeyed on from Bethel, but while they were still some distance on the go to Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered severe difficulties in her labor on the road, giving birth. And when she suffered severe difficulties in the labor, the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, you have been given another son." And as it came about, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she named him Ben-Anoi. But his father called him Benjamin, son of my right hand. This is the blessing of God to Jacob now, this Rachel that he loved, this beautiful love story, and had a son, Joseph, and now we hear about the birth of Benjamin. And this is going to play very prominently in the story of Joseph, which is coming next in Hebrews 11. Look at Genesis 35:23, just down a couple of verses. You'll see the kind of blessing God has given to Jacob. And the first point here is that to remember that God is the one who has blessed you. That there's this process, this love that's coming from God, and it's coming to us. God is the one who has blessed you. Genesis 35:9. God appeared to Jacob when he came from Paddan Aram, which is another way of saying Haran, and he blessed him. Here we see this blessing coming down again and again and again. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." And so he called him Israel. Remember, that happened previously. That happened back in Genesis 32. This is one of 5 times that God has appeared to Jacob. And he's got great plans for this guy. And he says, "I've got things in store for you, but you're a person on a journey. You're a person in process." Raise your hand if you're a person in process. Okay, those of you who didn't raise your hand, you're in there too. We're all people in process. And God is appearing to him, and he wants to remind him one more time. And we saw Jacob struggle with this new name, this new identity. God had told him he's got a new name, the name that God triumphs through me, triumphant with God, but he didn't believe it. And he's growing in that. And so God repeats to Jacob in Genesis 35 the blessing he gave to Abraham and to Isaac in Genesis chapter 12. I'd like for you to read this out loud with me, if you would. "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed.'" That word blessed shows up a bunch of times. Why? Because that's what God had in mind from the beginning, that all the nations of the world would be blessed. But you know, when we say God bless you, it's not just when somebody sneezes, right? It's when we want to convey something to someone. The word comes from the Greek to speak well. We hear it in the word eulogy. It comes directly from this, to speak well of someone. And we do it when we say, "Bless the Lord, O my soul." We're speaking well of God. When we invoke divine care for someone, we say, "The Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you." We see it when we want to confer prosperity on someone. Jacob blessed his sons. That's the idea that's happening here. And God is reminding Jacob again, that's my plan. That's my plan for you. That there's a place and there's a people and there's a purpose to bless all the nations of the world. There's two sides of it. God blesses you and then you're meant to bless others. I wonder sometimes if we forget the second half. I just want to get blessed. Bless me, God, bless me, God, bless me, God. There's nothing wrong with that. We believe that God will bring healing to your life, to your marriage, to your family. But if that's all that God has in store for you from your perspective, you're missing out, because the rest of the story is for God to bless others through you. God may fix your kids. God may make your marriage better. God may patch up your life. But his primary objective is to bring you to a place where you see you're part of something bigger, part of something so much larger than just our lives, that he wants to glorify himself through you and through me. Maybe somebody would say, well, listen, I've worked really hard for what I've gotten. It's my talents. It's my hard work. It's my discipline. Or, my parents sacrificed for me to have the education and the opportunities I have. And you can thank God for that. But the question is, where did those things come from in the first place? Paul said it this way: what do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as if you did not? One of our problems with North American, with Western culture, with probably just the world, is our idea that I deserve it. I've worked hard for it. I can succeed. That me-centered culture. It's about my advancement. It's about my prosperity. And if it's not about mine, it's about my kids, about my family. God has something so much bigger in mind than that. We're going to see in the verses that come in following here, God's blessing on Jacob, but that he turns the corner from being blessed to be a blessing to others. Genesis 35:23 talks about the sons of Jacob. And if you read through them, some of you who are familiar with the Bible and the Old Testament will recognize these names. The sons of Leah were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, then Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin, we just talked about. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's female slave, were Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Zilpah, Leah's female slave, were Gad and Asher. What we've just walked through are the 12 tribes of Israel. These 12 sons. Now, somebody might say, this is just a side note. Well, wait a minute. 4 different moms to 12 different sons, and how many daughters? What about polygamy? Why is God, condoning this, or is he condoning this? And my friends, definitely he's not. Monogamous marriage has always been God's plan. One man and one woman together for life. Where did polygamy get started? Well, it wasn't very long. It was Cain in Genesis chapter 4. And you see a lot of Bible characters with multiple wives. But those people did a lot of other things that God wasn't pleased with either. Solomon, so many wives, so much excess, and it was his downfall. And the nation of Israel was divided because of it. Here we are then. Know that, first of all, to be blessed, to be a blessing is to remember that God is the one who has blessed you. Now turn over to Genesis 37. And again, we're just going to see as God is taking Jacob through. Genesis 37 through 45 is kind of a big section. It's about Joseph. Because God has a huge plan for Joseph in the life of the family. And Glenn is going to spend several weeks talking about that in the new year. Genesis 46. Flip on over to Genesis 46. God appears to Jacob for the 5th time and tells him to go south to Egypt to escape the famine. Now, spoiler alert here, Joseph saves all of his brothers. Okay, just to let you know, so when that comes now. And they move the whole family to Egypt. Now, why? Because Pharaoh says, nobody wants to herd sheep in Egypt, so Israel, come on, bring everybody here. So they do. Genesis 47. All right, are you there? Genesis 47. Look at verse 7. And here's my second point this morning, that number one, remember that God is the one who's blessed you. Number two, that when you've been blessed, you want to be a blessing. Now, I love this picture of Jacob. Remember, the grabber, the conniver, the deceiver, the guy who's always got a scheme. Look at Genesis 47:7. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. Pharaoh, most powerful nation. He's this big wig. And here's Jacob, this farmer, this shepherd. And what does he do? And it says, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. I get the picture of Jacob like this. He's like, hey, how you doing? God bless you. How you doing? Blessings. Hey, how can I bless you? I mean, he has just turned into a blessing machine. Pharaoh asked him, he says, how old are you? And he says, I'm only 130. I'm just getting going. I'm on a roll here. I'm just getting going. I kind of picture him like our brother Glenn. You know? Glenn's like, I'm just getting going here. I'm a blessing machine. He wants to bless people. He wants to encourage people. He wants to help people grow. That's exactly where Jacob is. Jacob's got blessing on his mind. You realize that what you have is from God and you can freely share it with others. The New Testament says, freely you have been given, freely give. Give what you have to others. Now, there are hints of this in Jacob's life earlier when he was fleeing from Esau and he had that dream off in Bethel. Genesis 28, he says, God, you get me through this, I'm your man. I'm going to be a hot potato for you if you get me through this, if you bring me back into the land. And he says, and I will give you a tenth. I'll give you a tenth of what I have. Jacob said this way back when. Where did he get that from? Well, Abraham had said that. I'm sure Jacob had been sitting around the campfire when Grandpa Abraham was telling stories about the days and when he came into the city called Salem after having had a victorious battle in Genesis 14. And what did Abraham do? He says, I've met the king of Salem and I'm going to give him a tenth of everything I had. Now, some people say, well, is a tenth what God requires? You know, like some of you engineers, give me a figure, give me a number, right? Let me plug it into my calculator and this is what'll work out. And the tenth really does, it starts with Abraham. It starts with Jacob. But then we see it in the Old Testament. Remember, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the first 5 books of the Bible had not been written yet because Moses wouldn't show up for another 400 years, all right? So what happened then? Well, Moses came along and said, yeah, 10%'s not a bad thing. It'll be the Levites' tithe. By the way, the verses that I'm about to share with you are all in your notes. So if you want to go back and look these up later. There's also a festival tithe, and there's a welfare tithe. So the Jews, once the Mosaic covenant came along, said, okay, here's what I want you to do. Here's how society is going to run. These are like the federal income tax and social security tax and like state income tax. These are things that help our Jewish society to run. But then God also intended for free will offerings, first fruits, and blessings and giving from the heart. So God's plan had been to say, look, when you're going to benefit from something, take care of that, and then be generous on top of that with your giving. Some people say, well, God requires a tenth. I think the scriptures don't support that. The tithe may be a good place to start, but it's really about giving from a willing heart. And so you see this huge shift for Jacob, the conniver, the deceiver, the schemer, to being a blesser. Why is that such a shift? Because, friends, it will take faith for you to bless others. You have to give away something you could keep. You have to give away something you could enjoy. You're going to give, you're going to bless, you're going to confer prosperity upon someone else. That takes faith. And that's the point of Hebrews 11, 20 and 21. It takes faith to bless others. I love a quote that Richard Foster wrote several years ago. He said, "Most Christians have never seriously wrestled with the problem of honoring God with their finances. We have conveniently ignored Jesus' words on the subject. The reason is simple. This discipline directly challenges our vested interest in an affluent lifestyle. The practice of blessing others actively challenges the vested interest in an affluent lifestyle." He goes on to say, 15% of everything Jesus said relates to this topic, more than his teaching on heaven and hell combined. Why is that? Well, is God poor? Well, Jesus was poor, but it didn't bother him. No, God's not poor. God knows that it's the center of our hearts. You cannot serve God and riches. Jesus said you're going to serve one or the other. You can't have two gods. It's at the heart of our very being. Jesus referred to this tenth in the Old Testament as a starting point. But listen, he said in Matthew 23:23, "You tithe even your spices," he said to the Pharisees, "and that's right, you should. But you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness." You see how you can give on the outside and not have it enter your heart? That's what he has in mind. So when you've been blessed, you want to be a blessing. The third element of this, how to be a blessing, is to be sure to use discernment when blessing others. Turn over to Genesis 48 now. Okay, 27 chapters of Genesis, and 50 years later, we're ready for Hebrews 11:21. Right? There was that big of a gap between 20 and 21. Why? Because the writer of Hebrews is trying to make a point. He's bringing all these things in. It's not historical. We got Joseph in between here. But read this with me now, if you will. Hebrews 11:21. "By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff." So what's going on? Jacob is now 147 years old. And he's been transported to Egypt, where Joseph has saved the day. And they've moved in, and he sees his Joseph, and he sees all of his kids are there together, and he sees Joseph's sons, and he says, "Wow, I've got grandkids I didn't know about." He's so excited. And then it says in verse 10, 48:10, "Now the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he couldn't see," just like his dad, right? "And Joseph brought them close, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, 'I never expected to see your face. And behold, God has let me see your children as well.'" Jacob is so taken by these kids that he formally adopts them. We learned earlier in chapter 48. He just loves these boys. "And then Joseph," verse 12, "took them from his knees and bowed with his face to the ground. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim on his right hand toward Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right." You got the picture here? There's the patriarch, there's Joseph, there's Jacob, and he's ready to get blessed. Joseph has lined it all up. He's got the oldest right here on the right hand to get the greater blessing. He's got the younger on the left hand to get the lesser blessing. Right? He's recognized that this is a key moment. He's about to go. But old Jacob, he's still got some tricks up his sleeve, doesn't he? This is awesome. Look at verse 17. When Joseph saw that his place, Joseph sees this, he takes his hands and he crosses them. He crosses them. Now, what's going on there? He reaches his right hand and places it on the head of Ephraim, who is younger, and he takes his left hand and puts it on Manasseh's head. And Joseph, he's not excited about this. When Joseph saw his father had placed his right hand on Ephraim's head, it displeased him. He grasped his father's hand to move it over to Ephraim's head, from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head." Right? Joseph's going, no, that's not how it works. Dad, I know things are getting a little hard to remember now. He kind of gently comes along and corrects him. And I love this, but his father refused. "I know, my son, I know." Some of you said this to your kids. I know. "He will also become a people, and he will be great. However, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." What's happening here? Is Jacob kind of doing I'm going to repeat the Jacob and Esau thing, the younger and older? Is that what's happening? I don't think so. There's no deception here. Jacob knows exactly what he's doing. Jacob could see by faith, somehow God had revealed to him that Ephraim would take prominence over Manasseh among the tribes of Israel. And in fact, this wouldn't happen for hundreds of years. It wouldn't happen for hundreds of years. Even in Moses' day, Manasseh outnumbered Ephraim by more than 20,000, but eventually he did grow. He did grow. The world has a way of picking the strongest, the first, the tradition to say, you must be the leader. You must be blessed because you've got all these other things. And God says, no. I don't go by the strongest, by the fastest, by the smartest. The world would have picked Esau, the rugged outdoorsman. God picked the conniving Jacob. The world would have picked the older Manasseh, but God picked the younger Ephraim. So why doesn't God use the merit system? Because then it's all about us instead of being about him. God chooses the weak things of the world to shame them, to glorify himself. Jacob had kept his faith in God that he would return him to the land of promise, that he would bless these sons, that he'd be buried back in Canaan. Just like verse 22 says of Joseph, these guys looked ahead. How? Because they believed that God would keep his promise. And he listens to the Lord when giving his blessing. Listen, friends, when you bless others, you need to use discernment. You need to think about, you need to pray about, you need to actively engage in giving, in blessing, in helping others. You need to make wise choices. We don't have time to go into this today, but if you look in Genesis 49, Jacob actually brings all 12 of his sons together. 29:1, "Assemble yourselves that I may tell you what will happen to you in the days to come." Remember, that's what faith is. It's looking ahead in the days to come. And you say, well, why didn't Jacob give his firstborn son that blessing? Well, look, he tells in chapter 49, verse 3, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power, uncontrollable of water. You shall not have preeminence." What is Jacob doing? He's using discernment. He's trying to understand what would be the best place to bring blessing. Where will I give my resources? Where will I bless others? And he does that. Chapter 49, we can't go through all 12 here, but let me just point out chapter 49, verse 8. "As for you, Judah," remember, it's one of the first 5 sons that he has, Judah, "of your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, and your father's son shall bow down to you." Now, did Jacob understand what that prophecy would mean? Did Jacob understand that David and Solomon and a whole line of kings would come through Judah? Did Jacob understand that the Messiah would come through Judah? I don't think so. He just knew that God wanted to bless, and he was being faithful with what he had. So use discernment, friends. When you give, listen, it's from God. It's been given to you to bless others. Just like Jacob, you can use discernment when you bless others. Use discernment when you're giving. Advent, Christmas, is a story of God's blessing the world through Christ. And yet somehow it's become about materialism and conspicuous consumerism. We've lost the meaning. So use discernment when you give, when you bless. People like Advent Conspiracy have found out the radical idea that we can celebrate Christmas humbly, beautifully, and generously without going nuts. The New Testament says that we, basically the same thing the Old Testament says is, pay your taxes, give where you receive, and then give from a willing heart. And again, Paul makes it clear in 2 Corinthians 9. He says, you will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, through Paul, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. That's taking what God has given you and sending it on to others. This service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the Lord's people, but also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Blessing, thanks, and we'll see here in just a moment, worship. Let me just run through quickly some things about giving from the New Testament. And again, these verses are all in your notes, so we're not going to go into it at length here. But giving should be done generously and cheerfully. The New Testament indicates that this giving should be done in the context of a local Christian community that you're a part of. And generosity can go out beyond that as well for blessing others, but you should be thinking about and giving generously and proportionately to your income. Giving should be planned. 1 Corinthians 16:2, you need to decide. Don't just walk in and say, oh, it's Sunday. I guess I'll give what's ever in my wallet, if you even carry a wallet. And if you do carry a wallet, you probably don't carry any money in it anyway. So don't leave it to chance. Think about it ahead of time. Giving is to be sacrificial. Giving something that you won't be able to use for yourself in order to use it for God. Give in response to genuine and legitimate needs. Acts chapter 2. Giving reflects our faithfulness and integrity, and giving results in God's blessing. You want to look up those verses below in the questions for study. I encourage you to do so. So we're using discernment. We're using biblical principles in order to give to God. Find out where your money is going. If you want to know what Valley Church's finances are, our treasurer, Jamie, and Matt, our controller, are happy to tell you about where those things are happening. All right, let's finish with this. That blessing is a way of worshiping God. Hebrews 11:21, again, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph. And don't miss this now. I love this. And what does it say? Worshipped. And he worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. Some of you came in today leaning on the top of your staffs. I saw you. What does that mean? It just means he's old. Just means that he was frail. But it doesn't diminish his faith. In fact, now he's got a better picture of faith than he did when he was young and strong. Amen? He understands how needy he is. He understands how much he's been given, and he's excited to give it away. Remember when Abraham took Isaac up on the mountain? What was he going to do? He was going to make a sacrifice and to worship. What is worship? What does sacrifice look like in the New Testament? Romans 12:1 says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies, that's all of you, You can't go anywhere your body doesn't go. Present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. So many connections there between Abraham and Isaac. But because of what Christ has done for us, we can offer ourselves to him and worship. Not just with 10% or 20% or 30%, but of everything God has given us. Our time, our treasure, our talents, our passions, our giftedness, our experience. All those things can be given to God. We can say no to the God of self-indulgence and waste. We can grow in our faith. We can separate ourselves from materialism and consumerism. How? The antidote is generosity. To be generous, to give those things up and declare our faith as we do so. So, what keeps you from being a blesser? I'm going to invite the worship team to come on back up because we're going to do that. We're going to worship. And we're going to say yes to God. We're going to say, yes, God, I want to follow you with all my heart. And maybe today you'll say, I've been kind of a stingy person. I haven't been trusting God. I haven't been stepping forward by faith because I'm afraid. My faith isn't that big yet. I heard Darren give a great sermon on 2 Corinthians 9:7. It says, we'll start with whatever you can do joyfully. Trust him for that and allow that to grow. Where does your faith need to grow to become a blesser? We asked a group of people at Valley Church, we asked this question, why have you said yes to God and his invitation to worship through giving? And this is what one person said. This is not my story. I didn't write this. I wish I could have. It's so good. After I started working, it took me a while to start considering giving to the church. It wasn't until a friend asked me if I tithed that I actually started thinking about it. It caused me to think more about how I can contribute to the church's mission and vision through a simple act of giving. In the beginning, I didn't fully understand why I should give. But then I observed other members of the church and how it was a truly joyous thing for them, and it encouraged me more. There were people who were so willing to share what they had, whether it was their finances or possessions or gifts, just to help others in the church. When I noticed that these people saw themselves as stewards of these resources, they freely would give them to benefit God's kingdom. Again, this is a member of the congregation. I don't even know who it is. As I give now, I try to remind myself that nothing I have is mine. I don't deserve it. I didn't earn it. It's all a gift from above, and it would be a joy of mine to use it to help others. I think that whether we realize it or not, we use so many of the church's resources each week just by coming on Sunday or to a small group. Others in our community benefit so much when we decide to give. And when we give, we aren't just showing how sacrificial we are or to follow some Christian duty, but we are showing God that we care about his kingdom and that is a priority in our lives that surpasses our own needs. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the example of Jacob, who could go from a grabber to be a giver, to go from being deceitful and self-centered to being generous and wanting to bless others. Lord, help us not to wait until the end. Help us to practice that now and to enjoy your blessing as we do so. We praise you. We worship you. Lord, that's where it starts. It starts in our hearts. We praise you, from whom all blessings flow. Amen.